What if the reason your life has felt unusually heavy is not because you are falling behind, but because you were being prepared to carry light for people still lost in the dark? That question matters because many people spend years misreading the weight on their life. They call it failure. They call it delay. They call it being too emotional, too intense, too different, too hard to understand. But sometimes the weight is not punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes what feels heavy is not the proof that something is wrong with you. It is the evidence that something important is being formed in you. If you look back honestly, you may realize this has been true for a long time. You have never fully felt at home in ordinary spaces. You could function there, maybe even succeed there, but something in you always knew you were not meant to live only on the surface. You noticed things other people ignored. You felt things other people moved past. You carried questions that did not let you stay shallow for very long. And at times, that made life feel harder than it seemed for everyone else. You were unusually sensitive to people's pain. You could hear sadness under someone's smile, tension under someone's words, loneliness behind someone's strength. You found yourself carrying weight that didn't always make sense, almost as if your spirit was picking up on burdens your mind could not fully explain. And even when truth cost comfort, you were still drawn toward it. Even when it meant standing alone, even when it meant being misunderstood, something in you kept choosing what was real over what was easy. For a while, you may have interpreted that difference as a problem. Maybe you wondered why life never felt as simple for you as it seemed for others. Why certain things affected you so deeply. Why comfort never held you for long. Why your soul kept reaching for something deeper, cleaner, truer. But what if your difference was never meant to make you feel superior? What if it was never about ego at all? What if it was about service? Because you were not made to blend in, but not for the reasons people often assume. You were not made to stand out for applause. You were not shaped differently, so you could become obsessed with being special. You were shaped this way because some people are called not merely to survive the dark, but to carry light through it. And light does not get formed in shallow places. That is why God does not usually prepare leaders by making them loud first. He prepares them by making them deep. He allows them to wrestle. He lets them sit in questions that cannot be answered quickly. He takes them through seasons where applause disappears and identity is stripped down to what is real. Depth is formed in hidden places, not public ones. And if your life has felt weightier than you expected, it may be because God was not building a performer. He was building a vessel. This is why the story of Moses matters so much here. When Moses encountered the burning bush, the fire did not begin in that moment. The fire was already burning before Moses noticed it. Let that sink in. Heaven was already active before Moses understood what he was looking at. The sacred moment did not start when Moses arrived. It started before he recognized it. And the turning point in the story was not the start of the fire. It was Moses turning aside to see. That detail changes everything. Because many people assume calling begins when they finally understand it, name it, or step into it publicly. But the pattern in Scripture shows something different. Very often, calling is already burning long before the person carrying it can interpret the signs. The fire is already there. The assignment is already alive. The preparation is already underway. What changes is not heaven's activity. What changes is the person's awareness. And maybe that is exactly what this moment is for you. Not the beginning of something sacred, but the recognition of something sacred that has been burning for longer than you knew. The compassion you could never fully shut off. The truth you kept returning to. The weight you felt without explanation. The strange sense that your life was meant to carry more meaning than what was visible on the surface. Those things did not suddenly appear. They have been burning in you for years. So the tension is this. The calling in your life did not begin when you recognized it. It was burning long before you knew its name. And perhaps the reason this message finds you now is because, like Moses, you have arrived at a moment where the fire is no longer asking to be ignored. It is asking to be noticed. If the fire has been burning longer than you realized, then the next question naturally follows. Why did it take so long for you to notice it? Why did life seem to move through so many seasons that felt slow, confusing, or even disappointing before anything began to make sense? This is where most people misread their story. They look back at the difficult years and label them with one word: delay. They assume something went wrong, that time was wasted, that opportunities passed them by. But if we look at the story of Moses more carefully, a completely different picture begins to emerge. Moses lived what looked like 3 completely different lives before the burning bush ever appeared. The first 40 years were spent in Egypt, raised in Pharaoh's palace. He had education, influence, access to power, and the kind of opportunities most people could only imagine. From the outside, it probably looked like he was on a fast track toward significance. But that season ended abruptly when Moses acted on impulse, trying to defend his people through his own understanding. One moment he was a prince of Egypt. The next he was a fugitive running for his life. Then came the second 40 years, and these years looked nothing like the first. Moses ended up in Midian, far away from the power structures he once knew. Instead of political influence, he was tending sheep. Instead of palace halls, he walked through desert terrain. Instead of leading people, he lived in obscurity. From a human perspective, it would have been easy to interpret those years as failure. 40 years had passed, and nothing seemed to have moved forward. And yet the burning bush had not appeared yet. Think about how strange that is. 80 years of life had already passed. Most people would assume the window for purpose had closed. But heaven's timeline was operating on something deeper than visible progress. Those years in Egypt were not wasted. They taught Moses how systems of power worked. They exposed him to leadership structures, language, strategy, and culture. But the years in Midian were equally important. The desert trained things the palace never could. Those desert years built patience. They built resilience. They stripped away the identity Moses had built around status and replaced it with something quieter and stronger. In the palace, he learned how power looks from the outside. In the desert, he learned how to survive without it. In Egypt, he saw oppression up close. In Midian, he learned how to shepherd fragile lives through difficult terrain. None of those lessons looked dramatic while they were happening, but every single one expanded his capacity. And this is the part many people miss when they read their own story. The hard seasons in your life were not empty years. They were capacity-building years. They were forming things inside you that could not be built any other way. Maybe the years felt slow. Maybe the progress was invisible. But look at what those seasons quietly produced in you. Resilience, for example. You learned how to keep moving when things didn't go as planned. You learned how to keep showing up when no one was applauding. That kind of resilience cannot be taught in a classroom. It is formed through experience. Then there is compassion. People who have never walked through deep struggle often struggle to understand the pain of others. But when you have faced your own valleys, you begin to see people differently. You notice the quiet battles others are fighting. You become slower to judge and quicker to care. Compassion grows naturally in hearts that have been broken open by life. Discernment is another gift that often comes through difficult seasons. When you have walked through confusion, you start recognizing truth more clearly. You learn to sense when something is healthy and when something is not. You begin to hear what people are saying beneath their words. Discernment is not simply intelligence. It is wisdom shaped through lived experience. And perhaps one of the most overlooked strengths developed in hard seasons is endurance without applause. There were years when you kept doing what was right even when nobody noticed. Years when the work was quiet, unseen, and sometimes lonely. But that kind of endurance builds a stability that public recognition alone could never produce. This is why one of the most important truths about spiritual leadership is rarely discussed. People who lead others out of darkness usually know darkness intimately. They are not strangers to confusion, loneliness, or struggle. In fact, their ability to guide others often comes directly from the places where they themselves had to wrestle with the night. There is also a deeper psychological and spiritual layer to these seasons. Loneliness, for example, often builds listening. When the noise of constant validation disappears, you begin to hear your inner voice more clearly. You start to notice the subtle movements of your spirit. Silence becomes a teacher instead of an enemy. Obscurity also builds integrity. When no one is watching, the choices you make reveal who you really are. Character becomes rooted in conviction rather than reputation. You learn to live honestly without the pressure of performing for an audience. And failure, though painful, often breaks self-reliance in ways success never could. When plans collapse, when confidence is shaken, when things do not unfold the way you expected, something important happens. You stop pretending you are fully in control. You begin to lean into something deeper than your own strength. All of this is why the years that once looked like delay may actually have been preparation. The loneliness trained your listening. The obscurity strengthened your integrity. The failures dismantled the illusion that you had to do everything on your own. When we look back through that lens, the story changes completely. The timeline that once felt frustrating begins to look purposeful. The years that seemed slow start revealing their hidden work. So the key truth becomes clearer. The delay was never the absence of your calling. The delay was the shaping of the person who could carry it. If the hard years were shaping capacity, then the burning bush reveals the moment that capacity finally meets response. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal, because the real turning point in Moses' life was not the fire itself. The real turning point was his response to it. Many people imagine that when God calls someone, the defining moment is dramatic. They imagine thunder, certainty, instant confidence, a clear plan unfolding step by step. But when we read the actual moment in Exodus, the scene is surprisingly simple. Moses notices something unusual, a bush burning but not consumed. He turns aside to look at it. And when God calls his name, Moses does not deliver a speech. He does not present qualifications. He does not explain his history. He simply says two words, "Here I am." That response is small, but it carries enormous meaning. Moses did not respond with a resume. He did not remind God of his education in Egypt. He did not list the leadership experience he gained in Pharaoh's palace. In fact, Moses' life at that moment probably felt more like a list of disqualifications than qualifications. 80 years old, a past failure that forced him into exile, decades spent in obscurity. From the outside, none of that looked impressive. But heaven was not looking for a resume. Heaven was looking for availability. "Here I am" is one of the most powerful responses a human being can give to God, because it represents surrender before certainty. Moses did not yet know the full assignment. He did not yet understand what the fire meant. He had not been told about confronting Pharaoh or leading an entire nation out of bondage. All of that came later. The first step was simply being present. This is why the story pauses at an unexpected place. Before the mission is explained, before any details about Egypt or liberation are revealed, God gives Moses a strange instruction. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." At first glance, it may seem like a minor detail, almost symbolic. But if we look deeper, the instruction carries a profound spiritual meaning. Sandals were essential for traveling through rough terrain. They protected the feet from heat, stones, and sharp ground. They allowed someone to walk long distances without being injured. In other words, sandals were part of survival. And Moses had been surviving for a long time. 40 years in the desert requires a survival mindset. You learn how to guard yourself emotionally. You learn how to manage disappointment. You learn how to protect your heart from hoping too much. After enough difficult seasons, people naturally develop armor. Not because they are weak, but because they are trying to endure. That armor often shows up in subtle ways. Emotional distance, careful expectations, a reluctance to fully trust again, a quiet instinct to protect yourself from being hurt or disappointed. Those responses make sense when someone has walked through long seasons of exile or uncertainty. They are part of how the human spirit survives. But God tells Moses to remove the sandals. In other words, remove the layer of protection you developed during the journey. Remove the barrier between you and the ground you are standing on. Because the place you are standing now is not ordinary terrain. It is holy ground. That instruction reveals something important. Survival strategies that help you endure difficult seasons cannot always remain in place when you step into a calling. The armor that protected you in exile may prevent you from feeling what God is doing in the present. You cannot lead from numbness. You cannot carry light while remaining fully defended. Light requires contact. It requires openness. It requires the willingness to feel again, to hope again, to stand present before something sacred instead of shielding yourself from it. This is why the moment before the commission is not about power. It is about vulnerability. Moses is invited to stand barefoot before God, not as a prince, not as a fugitive, not as someone proving his worth, but simply as a person who is willing to be present. And that pattern repeats throughout Scripture. Before influence comes humility. Before authority comes surrender. Before someone carries a message to others, they must first stand honestly in the presence of God themselves. So the turning point in Moses' story was not the fire. The fire had already been burning. The turning point was the moment Moses stopped walking past it and allowed himself to encounter it fully. That moment is still the same today. The response that heaven waits for is rarely complicated. It is not a flawless plan. It is not a guarantee that everything will make sense. It is not a demonstration of perfect confidence. It is simply availability. Here I am. Those three words open the door to everything that follows. They are the opposite of hiding. They are the opposite of explaining why you are not ready. They are the opposite of waiting until you feel perfectly qualified. And this is why the central truth of this moment matters so much. God is not asking for a perfect plan. He is asking for an uncovered yes. If the turning point is simply saying, "Here I am," then the next question naturally follows. What does it actually mean to lead others out of darkness? Because when people hear language like that, their minds often jump to dramatic images. They imagine large crowds, powerful speeches, visible influence, or some kind of public platform where a single person stands in the spotlight while everyone else listens. But the truth is far quieter than that. Leading people out of darkness rarely begins with recognition. It rarely starts with a stage, a title, or a moment where everyone suddenly realizes how important you are. In fact, most of the time it begins in very ordinary places where almost no one is paying attention. Leading others out of darkness does not always mean preaching to crowds. It does not always mean having a public platform or building an audience. And it certainly does not always mean being celebrated for what you do. Many of the most important moments of guidance happen quietly, in conversations, relationships, and small encounters that never make headlines. Sometimes leadership looks like speaking peace into confusion. When people around you are overwhelmed, anxious, or uncertain, your steadiness becomes a kind of light. You remind them that clarity still exists, even when emotions are chaotic. You help them slow down long enough to see what is real instead of reacting to every wave of fear that passes through the room. Other times, leadership appears as calm during crisis. When situations become tense and everyone begins reacting emotionally, the person who can stay grounded becomes incredibly valuable. Not because they are louder than everyone else, but because their stability creates space for others to breathe again. Darkness often spreads through panic. Light often begins with composure. Sometimes leading someone out of darkness is even simpler than that. It can be helping one person see clearly when they are trapped in confusion. A single conversation that reminds someone of their worth. A question that helps them think differently about a situation. A moment of honesty that helps them recognize truth they were avoiding. These moments may look small from the outside, but for the person experiencing them, they can become turning points. And there are seasons when leadership simply means holding hope when others lose it. People pass through times where discouragement clouds everything they see. When that happens, someone who still believes in the possibility of light becomes incredibly important. Hope is contagious, just like fear is. When one person refuses to surrender to despair, it can quietly strengthen everyone around them. This is why the story of Moses includes another important detail that is often overlooked. Moses initially believed his limitations disqualified him. He told God that he struggled to speak clearly, that he was not the kind of person who could stand before powerful leaders and deliver a message. But instead of removing that weakness, God introduced Aaron. Aaron became the voice that complemented Moses' calling. Where Moses felt unsure, Aaron could speak with clarity. Where Moses hesitated, Aaron supported him. Together they carried the assignment forward. This reveals something important about how divine missions often work. God does not expect one person to embody every strength required for the journey. The places where you feel weakest are often the places where help appears. The mission you are called to carry was never meant to rest entirely on your shoulders. People will enter your life whose strengths connect with your limitations in ways that make the path possible. Just as Aaron met Moses in the wilderness, support often arrives while you are still walking toward the assignment. So the practical truth becomes very simple. Your voice, your presence, your story, and your steadiness all carry light. Not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. Not because you have every answer, but because you are willing to walk in truth even when the path is unclear. This is the deeper insight that changes everything about leadership. You do not lead by being impressive. You lead by being available to truth. One of the most honest parts of the Moses story happens after the calling. Many people assume that once clarity arrives, everything immediately becomes easier. But Scripture shows the opposite pattern. When Moses finally returned to Egypt and confronted Pharaoh, the first response was not relief. The first response was increased pressure. Pharaoh removed the straw. In ancient brickmaking, straw was necessary to hold the clay together. When Pharaoh took it away, the Israelites were still required to produce the same number of bricks, but now they had to gather the materials themselves. The workload did not decrease. It intensified. From the outside, it looked like Moses had made everything worse instead of better. That moment is deeply important because it reveals something about the nature of calling. The first movement after clarity often feels harder, not easier. When you begin stepping toward what God has placed in front of you, resistance sometimes increases before freedom appears. And when that happens, many people make the same mistake. They assume the increased difficulty means they misunderstood the direction. They think the pressure proves they made the wrong decision. But often the opposite is true. Resistance after clarity is not proof that you missed God. It is often proof that the assignment is real. Pharaoh increased the burden because he felt the shift. Systems that benefit from darkness do not release control easily. When someone begins walking toward truth, alignment, and purpose, the environment around them sometimes pushes back. That is why this moment requires maturity. When things get heavier, the instinct is often to retreat, to go back to what felt familiar, to return to the desert where expectations were lower and the risks felt smaller. But if Moses had retreated at that moment, the story would have ended before the plagues ever began. So the practical wisdom here is simple but powerful. Do not retreat when things get heavier. Do not assume increased pressure means you chose the wrong direction. And do not abandon clarity just because the evidence has not fully appeared yet. There is often a window between calling and visible breakthrough. A space where the promise has been spoken, but the results have not yet manifested. In that space, the most important thing you can do is hold the word you received. Because when you look back later, the perspective changes. What once looked like exile reveals itself as approach. What once felt like delay becomes formation. What once appeared ordinary begins to look like holy ground where something sacred was quietly taking shape. So if this message resonates with you, take a moment to acknowledge it. Like this video if you choose calling over comfort. Subscribe to Chosen by God for faith content that is grounded, mature, and spiritually sharp. And in the comments, write a simple response that carries the same spirit Moses gave at the burning bush. Here I am. Because the truth is this: God did not train you in the dark so you could stay there. He trained you there so you could lead others out.